Amina's days on the plantation were filled with endless suffering, each moment a new chapter in her story of pain. From the moment she was dragged off the slave ship, she was thrust into a world where her body was not her own, where every breath was a borrowed one, bought with blood, sweat, and tears. Her new life began in the fields. The sun was harsh, unforgiving, beating down on her back until her skin cracked and bled. The overseer, a man with eyes as cold as steel and a heart that knew no mercy, watched them from dawn to dusk. His whip, a long, black snake, lashed out without warning. Amina learned quickly that there were no second chances here. She was made to pick cotton with hands that were not yet healed from the chains of the ship, her fingers torn and bleeding from the sharp bowls. Each time she slowed, even for a moment, the overseer's whip would find her, leaving angry, red welts that stung like fire. Sometimes he would strike her just to hear her cry out, to remind her that she was nothing. But the whip was just the beginning. Amina's food was little more than scraps. A few grains of corn, a piece of stale bread. Often, she went to bed with her stomach gnawing in hunger, the emptiness a constant reminder of her place. Her body grew weaker, thinner, her cheeks hollowed, her bones visible under her dark skin. She slept on the cold, hard floor of a wooden hut, her bed a pile of straw that did little to soften the ache in her back. Her sleep was haunted by dreams of home, of her mother's voice, but she would wake to the sound of cries, to the smell of sweat and fear that clung to the air like smoke. The work was brutal, but the nights were worse. The master, a man named John Cartwright, would sometimes send for her. She was terrified each time his men came for her, knowing what was to come. They would drag her to the big house, where the walls were lined with portraits of people who looked like him, men and women who had never known a day of suffering. They would shove her into his chamber, the door slamming shut behind her. John Cartwright would be waiting, his face a cruel mask of desire and disdain. He would make her stand before him, inspecting her as if she were an object, something he owned, something without feelings or soul. His hands were rough and hard, grabbing at her with a violence that left bruises deep and dark on her skin. He took pleasure in her fear, his laughter sharp and jagged. He would whisper things in her ear, things that made her skin crawl, promises of more pain to come. He would force himself upon her, his weight crushing her, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. Amina learned to turn her face away, to close her eyes, to try and disappear into the darkness of her mind. But there was no escape from the pain, no relief from the shame that burned in her heart like a never-ending fire. Afterward, he would leave her there, on the cold floor, her body aching, her spirit broken. Sometimes he would beat her, striking her with his fists, his blows heavy and cruel. He would taunt her, call her names, spit on her, as if her suffering brought him joy. And when he was done, he would tell her to clean herself up, as if she could wash away the filth he had poured into her soul. The other women would see her return to the quarters, limping, her eyes hollow and dead. They would whisper prayers for her, knowing her pain, knowing it was only a matter of time before they, too, were called. But even when she thought she could endure no more, even when her spirit was stretched to the breaking point, there was still more suffering to come. The day she found out she was with child, a new fear gripped her heart. The child was his, a living reminder of her torment. She feared what would happen, what he would do. When he found out, he laughed, a cold, cruel laugh that sent shivers down her spine. "You'll birth it in the field like the animal you are," he sneered, his eyes gleaming with malice. The months of her pregnancy were an agony of their own. He made her work harder, pushing her beyond her limits. "You think you can rest because you're with child?" he would shout, kicking at her feet. "There's no rest for you. You will work until the child is born, and then you will work some more." Her body grew heavier, her steps slower, but the whip never ceased, and the insults never stopped. When the day came, it was in the middle of the cotton fields. Her labor began with sharp, ripping pain that tore through her like a knife. She tried to keep working, knowing the overseer was watching, but her body betrayed her, falling to the ground, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The other women gathered around her, shielding her from the overseer's gaze. They held her hand, whispered words of encouragement, but the pain was too much. She screamed, a long guttural cry that carried through the fields. Her baby, Kofi, was born in the dirt, beneath the open sky, with the overseer's eyes glaring down at her. The other women wrapped him in a piece of cloth, handed him to her. For a moment, just a moment, Amina felt a flicker of joy, a brief spark in the darkness. But then the overseer grabbed the baby from her arms, holding him up as if inspecting livestock. "He's not yours," he said, his voice cold. "He belongs to the master." Amina's days became even harder with Kofi by her side. She worked with him strapped to her back, his cries mingling with the sounds of the field. When he grew too heavy, she would set him down in the shade, her eyes constantly darting to make sure he was safe. But there was no safety on the plantation. The overseer began using Kofi against her, threatening to take him away whenever Amina slowed, whenever she faltered under the weight of her exhaustion. "Work faster," he would say, his whip cracking in the air, "or your boy will be sold." And then came the day when she returned from the fields, her body aching, her heart heavy, to find Kofi gone. She ran through the quarters, her voice hoarse from screaming his name. The other women turned away, unable to meet her eyes, knowing there was nothing they could do. Amina fell to her knees at the master's house, her hands clawing at the dirt, begging for her son, but all she received was a cruel smile. The days that followed were a blur of pain and emptiness. Her body was beaten, her spirit shattered. The master, angered by her pleas, had her locked in the barn, where she spent days in darkness, without food or water, her body burning with fever, her mind lost in a fog of grief. The overseer would come and taunt her, kicking at her feet, spitting on her, reminding her of what she had lost. "You'll never see him again," he whispered, his voice like ice in her ear. When they finally let her out, she was a shadow of herself, her eyes hollow, her face gaunt. She went back to the fields, her steps slow, her back bent, her heart numb. She no longer cared about the whip, about the master's anger. Her son was gone, and with him her last reason to live. Amina picked up the stick she sharpened and stuck it deep under her belly. This is just one of the story of what our people had to endure. Never forget.